Welcome to My Therapist Says, an interactive experience enriching your most important relationships. During today's event, I'll be your host and moderator as we present Redeemed Sexuality, a guide to sexuality for Christian singles, campus singles, teens, and parents. Sexuality is sacred and is a precious gift from God. As we focus on today's topic, I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Konzen, a licensed marriage and family therapist, author, certified sex therapist, radio personality, and a good friend of mine. Dr. Konzen has been a regular guest on our broadcast over these past 10 years. Today's event takes place before a live audience, live streaming, and questions from the audience and those listening to this broadcast, while offering practical biblical and scientific solutions. It's like having your own Christian doctor within the comforts of your living room. I hope you will sit back, relax, and take in these life-changing insights. Please join me as we now connect with a live audience and My Therapist Says. Welcome to My Therapist Says, and we're so glad that you are here this evening, and I want to welcome Dr. Jennifer Konzen, our specialist this evening, as we talk about a very important topic, the redeemed sexuality. Would you join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Konzen?
Well, it's great to be here, and this is a topic near and dear to my heart in helping people understand sexuality and how to live out their sexuality. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, but I'm also a certified sex therapist, and I work with married couples, and I wrote a book for married couples, and I have 4 children. And so we have campus and teens over at our house all the time, and the campus and teens are like, well, what about us? So out of their questions came the book Redeemed Sexuality, which is actually what we're going to talk about tonight, is how do you live out your sexuality if you're not married? And so some of you here are married tonight wondering, why in the world am I here tonight? Because actually it applies to all of our lives. How do we live out our sexuality, and then how do we help those in our lives who are not married deal with their sexuality, live as a sexual person in the way that God really calls them to? So let's go ahead and begin. The question I got right as we were putting the book together is, well, what exactly is redeemed sexuality? What do you mean by that? And that's a really good question. So Webster's Dictionary, the word redeemed literally means a buying back or a winning back, like freeing something from distress, from harm, and from captivity. Those are great definitions. And then when you look at the Galatians 3:13 says, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law. So that word redeemed, which is all throughout the New Testament, in the Greek, what that word literally means, it's exagorazo, and it means to fully buy out and to ransom, to do whatever it takes to buy something. So when you apply that to sexuality, that, it's not just about stopping us from doing the wrong thing sexually. It's about keeping us safe as we pursue our sexuality. Both ends, that we can, and this is actually directly out of the book, we can experience a redeemed sexuality, a living out of our sexuality as God intends, where sexuality can be all out freed. It's not just freed, but completely freed from the distress, the captivity, and the harm that Satan has done, and that it can be lived out instead as a blessing. So when you think about that definition, there's also, so what does that mean in everyday life? And so the first thing we're going to hit on, and I'm going to actually hit on a number of things, some of them very lightly, some in a little bit more detail, is what is God's plan for sexuality, period? And then how does that apply to those who are not in a marital sexual relationship? So what does the Bible say about sex? We're going to tap on. How do our interactions around sexuality as families affect how we live it out? And this is just the first section. And then how do we deal with the need for touch and for connection if we're not in a marital sexual relationship? So what does the Bible say about sex? Well, you'd be surprised. It actually says quite a lot. And so one of the things that's surprising is this in Ezekiel 16 and Ezekiel 23. And this is straight out of Sex and the Supremacy of Christ by Piper and Taylor, that sexuality is actually designed by God as a way to communicate with us, to really share his heart. And when you look at Ezekiel 16 and Ezekiel 23, he's actually talking to the nation of Israel, and he's expressing to them the pain of their committing idolatry, they're worshiping other gods, and he uses sexual language to talk about it. He talks about how I bathed you, I wiped the blood off of you, I raised you, I gave you jewels and beautiful clothing, and then you went and prostituted yourself. And he goes into vivid detail on you let them fondle your breasts. And then in Ezekiel 23, he says over and over, prostitutes and fondling. And then he says you had the emission of donkeys and the genitals of horses. What's up with that? Why would he even put that in there, right? Very explicit sexual language. And he's talking about the nation of Israel. He's actually not talking about sexuality. He's making a spiritual point using sexual language. Why? Because we get that. When you think about marriage, I work with married couples, and the biggest, deep pain that can happen is when there's any kind of unfaithfulness in a marital relationship. And some of you may have experienced that. It may have happened in your family. And so he knows we understand that, and so he uses the language of adultery to express his heart to us. He wants the people of Israel, of course, in the book of Ezekiel, to understand the depth of the pain he's feeling, and so he uses the sexual language to express it. He's showing his heart by talking about sexuality, right? So God's using sexual language to show us who he is so that we can know him more fully. And it's really also reflected when you look at just the language, the overarching language that's used in the Bible about sexuality. So this would come from Matthew 1 and Genesis 4. So this is Joseph did not know Mary until after she had Jesus. And then in Genesis, Adam knew Eve. The word know there in two different languages, in the Greek is gnosko, and in the Hebrew is yada. It's the same word that's used in both the Old and New Testament to mean God knows us. Jesus says, I know the Father, and the Father knows me. So this word to know, this depth of intimate knowing, is the word that is used where it says Joseph did not gnosko Mary. He did not know Mary until after he had Jesus. And he's talking about they didn't have sex until after Jesus was born. Adam knew Eve, yada. Adam yada Eve. He knew her. So the same word that's used to describe the depth of intimate knowledge between Jesus and God and between us and God is the word he uses to describe their sexual relationship. Not because God and Jesus is a sexual thing, but because that depth of intimate knowing is what sexuality is really supposed to be about. Think about that just for a minute. This is the overarching view of sexuality, that it's not necessarily about orgasm, it's not necessarily about the acting out of sexuality, although those things are included. It's about the depth of intimate connection. That's God's plan. So it's vital that we have an understanding of the scriptural language around sexuality. Now, one thing we do know pretty well is that our knowledge of God should guide our sexuality. And this is actually, Romans 1 does a great job of explaining how, because of their lack of paying attention and holding on to the knowledge of God, they ended up pursuing all kinds of different sexual acts that God didn't intend. Well, what's that about? So our depth of intimate knowledge of God, not just who is he and what's the Bible say, but our depth of knowing his character can then guide our sexuality. Why is that important? Because we need to understand God's view of sexuality if we're ever going to understand how we ought to live it out. Now, the other thing is, too, on understanding sexuality, is there's all kinds of other lovely words in the Bible. The word honorable is used. The word intoxicating is used. That's along with the word reeling, burning, and refreshing. And what happens is when we're explaining sexuality to those who are not married, or those who are contemplating marriage, who are single, who are campus, who are teens, we don't often tell them these words. We tell them that don't have sex, keep the marriage bed pure, keep it honorable. We say those things, don't get pregnant. But we don't explain to our children and to our singles and to our campus students that actually, what does the Bible say about sex? Well, when you look at Proverbs 5, it says that the man, he's looking at his wife's breasts, and he's intoxicated by her love. So the word there means he's reeling around drunk. In other words, sex should be that great in that marital relationship that it makes you go, ugh, right? It should be that good. We should be telling those who are not married that so that they get God's view of sexuality. We tend to go, no, we don't want to do that because then they might end up doing sex when we don't want them to. We need to give each other a clear picture of the beauty of sexuality as God lays it out. Paul is actually saying to the single man, if you're burning for your engaged, the woman you're engaged to, then go get married. You know, well, what's he saying there is the burning needs to occur where? In marriage. So in other words, sex should cause some burning. The word there is peru, which means fire. So sex should be full of fire. And then when you look at Proverbs 5 and Song of Solomon 4, you see all of these lovely metaphors for sex and sensuality, and they're all about water. That it should be like a cistern, a fountain, a spring, a well. What does that mean? It means that our sexuality should be this constant, refreshing, thirst-quenching adventure. So it's important. The Bible is full of what not to do sexually. Actually, most of the comments in the Bible about sexuality are what not to do. But it is also full of all these beautiful explanations of how sex should be. And we need to be discussing that, even among the unmarried among us. So the other pieces about this is that, you can go to the next slide here. Yes, the Bible definitely teaches about sex being honorable. That's Hebrews 13. And that then he uses in Romans 1 that when we pursue not knowing God, it's then dishonorable. Same word there. And it's interesting because Paul talks about the unpresentable parts of the body in 1 Corinthians 12 and how we're supposed to treat them with special honor. What are the unpresentable parts of your body? If I had you shout them out, you would probably say the breasts, the buttocks, the penis, the scrotum, and the vagina, and so on. Those would be the parts that we're probably not supposed to walk outside and flash, right? Well, what does the Bible say? How are we supposed to treat them? With special honor. So he's using the physical body to explain the spiritual. So we need to see sex as something beautiful and honorable and refreshing and intoxicating. So the other thing is that when I'm explaining sexuality to anybody, but then especially to people who are not married, is that our families and our backgrounds affect how we view sexuality. And that includes that when families don't talk openly about sexuality, it makes people feel very like sex is a taboo, it's dirty. So I did a research study where every single woman in the research study, they hadn't talked openly about sexuality in their family, and the feeling that they experienced was sex is dirty, sex is taboo. So the lack of talking openly among families is quite problematic. And then definitely if there's a negative sexual relationship and the kids pick up on that, that could have affected your view of sexuality, and it can affect people as they mature. And then definitely when families don't talk openly about puberty, so this is the biological changes in the body, when the hormones change, that can also give a message that sexuality is negative. And I can't tell you the number of men and women I work with where mom and dad didn't talk about, the emissions that were happening at night for young boys. They didn't talk about puberty for girls and how it all works. And so then it becomes, again, just this other hidden thing. The other piece, I love this. Am I glad to get that straightened out? Now I can go home and explain it to my dad. So this is a kid, having the sex talk at school, right? And they're hearing more about it at school than they are at home, which is actually where they should be hearing it and understanding it. So, next slide. Now, the piece here, this is just in the first section, is on touch as well. We've got to talk about touch because when people, this is so common in my office, where they say that when I hit the years of puberty, my parents weren't touching me any longer. Parents aren't sure what to do. Should I still hold them? I had a mom ask me, is it okay if my teenage son still puts his head in my lap? What do we do? We have got to have healthy touch and healthy, enjoyable affection in families, because then what will happen is when people come into my office and they're adults, they're saying, I just felt like something was wrong with me because all of a sudden my dad wasn't hugging me anymore. All of a sudden my mom wasn't, cuddling with me anymore. So now, yes, during those growing up years, people can also have violating touches happen to them. They might be uncomfortable with touch in the early years. But we've got to remember that touch has huge benefits health-wise, and that young adults who aren't experiencing sexuality need to be hugged, let me tell you. So those of you here who aren't single, who are married, please go hug the singles and campus students and teens, because often, well, they might go away, but often they're starved for touch. I can't tell you how often that comes into my office as well. So here's another area of sexuality that's important. That's the overall development. I am barely going to touch on this, but it is important to understand the overall development of sexuality through the years, from being a baby all the way through, the teen years. And so the other big thing, and you can go to the next slide here, is that body image has a big impact on the development of sexuality. And so when parents make negative comments about the body, people they feel like they have to cover up their body when they are married and having sex with somebody they can enjoy sex with, but they aren't feeling great about their body image because of negative comments that were made either in the media or by their parents. And so poor body image, and this is not just true for women. We have this kind of idea that poor body image is a female thing, but it's not. And it heavily affects when people do engage sexually. And this includes when they engage sexually before marriage and during marriage. And so when I work with couples, I'm helping them even discuss how they feel about their bodies. All right. And then, obviously, one of the biggest things that can happen is if there's any kind of sexual trauma. So this, again, has to do with the development of sexuality. If there's any violating touches, if there's actually any penetrative sexual acts that happen, if there's any rape or molestation, that has a huge impact on the development of sexuality. And so people often have to get involved in trauma therapy in order to then have healthy sexual relationships. And so that's what I am often helping people with, is how to have a healthy sexual relationship when they have a background with sexual trauma. And then one of the biggest areas, which I kind of touched on earlier, is the depth of things that come up regarding shame and sexuality. And let me tell you, like I said, the lack of talking about it is one of the biggest things that creates feelings of shame around sexuality. And definitely when I'm working with adults who are dealing with pornography and masturbation, there's a lot of shame around pornography and masturbation and how to talk openly about it. It's the biggest thing I hear from it's fun because I do these workshops for singles and campus and teenagers, and the biggest thing they say is we need to be able to talk about it. There are actually 2 chapters in my book. They're my favorite chapters, and they're not written by me. One of the chapters is written by 19 to 26-year-olds, quite a few of them, who I interviewed, and they told me what was it like in the teen years. And one of the big, what did they hear? What were they told about sexuality at school, at home, and at church? And their exact words are in there. And I tell you, it was really moving for me to put that chapter together. Why? Because one of the biggest things that they shared is that they didn't have anybody to talk to. They didn't feel like it was something they could talk about. And you, those of you who are older, probably are like, yeah, that's how I felt as well. We've got to open up the conversation around sexuality rather than it being a shameful thing, so that then we can have victory over some of the challenges with sexuality. And one of the biggest things that comes up around shame is, and I was talking with a young campus ministry of girls, and we talked about when you feel aroused. And I literally asked them, have you ever had a thought, and these are all single women, have you ever had a thought or pictured something or seen something, and all of a sudden your vagina starts throbbing? And they're all like, oh, I can't believe you just said that. And I'm like, do you know what that is? That's actually your God-given sexual response. God actually created your body to have blood flow go to the genitals so that then when you engage in sex, it's enjoyable. And so then after you notice, my body is doing X, Y, and Z because of this flash of a thought, and obviously if we indulge it and focus on it and actually try to cause it to happen, that's a whole different picture. But sometimes it just happens. And so a lot of times these young, single, and let me tell you, married folks tell me the same, where they feel a lot of shame for that sexual response. And one of the things that I help people with is, well, wait a minute. Sometimes one of the first things to do is go, that's my God-given body responding, and now what do I do with it? And that's when you bring in your values and your beliefs on how do you respond to that. But dealing with the shame about arousal is a big piece. Okay, we're not going to go into this any longer, but here's a big old picture on prenatal, birth, early childhood. How does gender develop through the years, gender identity, different forms of attractions, what goes through puberty, and then into adulthood. So go ahead and go to the next slide here. Again, I'm only tapping on this. So this would be sexual identity formation. This is a big question in our communities right now, is with the LGBT community. How do we even understand if you have a family member, someone you love dearly, who's expressing that they have different attractions to the same sex, or maybe they're attracted to both sexes, or maybe they wonder if they're in a boy's body and am I a girl, the whole transgender piece. How do we understand that? And I love the work of Mark Yarhouse. You can actually buy a number of his books, and he talks about the different areas: biological sex, gender identity, the persistence of attraction, and then when that becomes volition and behavior. And then he talks about having a valuative framework. So he brings in the piece of when your values and your beliefs are different than what your attractions are, what do you do with that? If you have beliefs that are different than what you're feeling in your body, if you believe certain things from the Bible, but then you're having these feelings and attractions, what do you do with that? And so he does a great job of exploring that so that those with Christian beliefs can actually examine how to respond to different attractions and how they develop over the years. So when you look at the other pieces around redeemed sexuality, those would be sexual feelings and practices, and then what do you do when you're single and when you're a teen? And so I do, when I'm speaking with singles and teens and campus students, and then when I speak with married folks, I go over in vivid detail the anatomy around sexuality. Why? Because we need to understand our bodies and that they are what? Fearfully and wonderfully made. And how can we embrace the sexual part of our bodies? I actually just had a women's group up in LA, 500 women, and we were talking about how everybody say nose, and they shouted nose. Everybody say elbow, elbow. Everybody say cheek, cheek. Everybody say vagina, and it gets really quiet. I'm like, no, everybody say vagina. I'm like, all of those parts of your body are created by God. Now, this was a women's group, and when I do it with men, we say penis. That was created by God. I just said those two words in about a couple sentences, right? We are uncomfortable with sexual terminology, and yet God created those parts of our body. Those parts of our body are also fearfully and wonderfully made. And it is vital that we don't avoid being amazed by God's creation, including the sexual parts of our body. Actually, in the back part of the book, it starts off with, this is a book for single people who are not married. And listen to the opening line. You're probably going to kill me for this, Dawn. You are a sexual person. And we think, oh, no, this is written for singles and campus and teens. You can't say they're a sexual person. I'm sorry, they've been sexual since the moment they were conceived. Mm-hmm. Discerning whether they're boy and girl. And actually, even sometimes in the womb, babies will touch themselves. And then as babies, they'll caress themselves to soothing, right? They've been at least experiencing sexual sensations, often quite young. It's not necessarily a sexual thing. It's usually more of a soothing thing during those years. But then the feelings around sexuality start out more about gender during those years, in the toddler years and into the early school years. Well, in other words, we're sexual beings our whole entire lives. So we have to talk about it, whether we're married, whether we're single, whether we're students, whether we're hoping to get married, and so on. So it's important. I mean, they're going to be, our singles and campus and teens, they're going to be hearing about sexuality in their classes at school. We should be talking about it in God's family, in God's church, and we should be talking about anatomy. So how does that apply to somebody as far as saving themselves? So this would be the term that you would use about, I want to save my sexuality until I want to save acting on my sexual desires until I'm married. Well, how do you do that? Well, I got this call. My daughter she says it's okay, I share this. She was in Africa serving at an orphanage, and I didn't get a call, actually, it was a text. And she says, Mom, what are the scriptures that say you're supposed to wait until you're married to have sex? And I was like, my daughter's in Africa. And I'm like, why are you asking this question? And she said, ha, 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 some of the girls here, because it was a secular orphanage that she was working at, they are asking me these questions. And so she's sharing her faith in Africa to a bunch of these young women from all over the world, and she was trying to explain to them what the Bible teaches and why she was waiting. And I was like, cool. And so I texted her with some scriptures, and then I had a bunch of friends say, can you send me those scriptures? I'm not sure how to answer that question. And the reality is we often aren't sure. And it's very important that you know how to answer that question. We tend to say, just don't do it. Don't do it until you're married. But what does the Bible actually teach? And I really don't have enough time to go into all those details tonight. But the Bible's actually got all kinds of helpful things. There's more than one scripture. There's quite a few about God's intention for sexuality. And what's important to know about for young folks is that they're hearing all kinds of stuff. If you actually look up on the internet, Should You Wait to Have Sex? This is one of the books you'll find. It's called Good Christian Sex: Why Chastity Isn't the Only Option, and Other Things the Bible Says About Sex. This is a book written by a woman who's a pastor, and she's saying that you can have sex when you're not married, and it's okay. Yeah, right. This is what you've got to understand what they're hearing. You've got to understand what's on the internet. And you've got to be able to answer them without saying, of course the Bible says you can't have sex until you're married. There's very valid questions that people have about sexuality. And I tell you, my daughter asked me that. It really forced me to make sure I knew how to answer her. So I love this, though. This is so amazing because it so teaches you the heart of Jesus. This is in Deuteronomy. If a man happens to meet in a town a virgin pledged to be married, and he sleeps with her, he shall take both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death. Who wrote that passage? God did. Okay? God wrote that passage about how to deal with people engaged in sexuality outside of marriage. And then God comes on the stage in John 8. And a woman is caught in adultery and brought right in front of him. God, who wrote Deuteronomy, then says, well, if you haven't sinned, throw a stone. Everybody leaves. He says to her, where's everybody? Nobody condemns. So I don't condemn you either. Go live your life of sin. God, who wrote the passage saying, this is the punishment, took the punishment himself and said, now, go live the way I want you to. So he lived out how to respond to sexuality when we live in it in a way that's not his intention. God is so incredibly merciful. Right? Doesn't that just get your heart? Jesus, look at the love of God in that whole section. So then, how do we help those? This isn't just for the singles. This is for the marrieds. How do you pursue holiness and purity? Number one, we need to examine how we feel about purity. You know how we talk about purity? That it's like this dirty word. I have to be pure. I better be pure. I'm trying to be pure. I mean, it's just like this negative thing. When actually, when you think about it, what would you rather have? I have a picture of some of the water of a friend of ours. They're from China, and he showed me the river by his house. And I'm like, oh, wow, would you like to drink a glass from that river? Or would you like to have some, a bottled water here in the that you can buy in Vaughn's? Well, we like pure water. If we had a choice on which one to drink, it's super positive. And yet purity is viewed really negatively, and we have to really learn how to view purity in a whole new light, that it is more an issue. It's not an issue of deprivation, but of benefit. Now, I'm just tapping onto that today, but grasping what the Bible actually teaches. What is the biblical sexual ethic instead of, I've got to be pure? Because often, really, this is how we teach purity. Don't get pregnant, don't wear that, don't watch that, and don't do that. That's how we teach purity, right? And really, how effective is that? Well, Diffleys, how effective is that? Right? We just talked about that before you came in, that people are going ahead and living however they want to live in their sexuality. That's not God's plan. So it is possible to pursue purity. We often tend to think about it as for singles and married men that they shouldn't do pornography. But let me tell you, what about the women among us and the kind of novels they're reading and the kind of fantasizing that's going on and the kind of what you would call soft porn? And then when I'm dealing with, and this actually came up, one of you asked me this question on the way in here, is, boy, it would have been nice to have some talking about this a little bit more openly when we were dating. Because how do we figure out the line about what we should or shouldn't do while we're dating? Should we engage in this is a big one. Is it okay to bring each other to orgasm when we're dating? We're not actually having intercourse. Every single campus and teen out there is wondering the answer to that question. We have to be able to talk openly about it. Can you have orgasm without intercourse, and is that sex or not? Well, we've had some prominent figures in our country asking that exact question. You know, people don't like to share about their questions, and they don't like to share about their mistakes because we can shame them in talking about them. And it's just vital that we make sure that when we're talking with those who have sexual questions that we don't condemn them for their questions, right? And also, by the way, when it comes to really pursuing purity, we tend to think of it more of a male thing, and we have male support groups, but let me tell you, it is very much a female thing as well. So we need to support the women in our ministries as well. So, how to talk openly. We do think, again, women don't struggle with this. This is the biggest thing. This is out of James 1. We tend to think about, we're going to talk about purity. James 1 talks about the man has an evil desire. Each man has, by their own evil desires, they're dragged away and enticed, and then they sin, and then it leads to death. And we talk about the sin and the death part, but notice the first part of the scripture. He says that they are dragged away and enticed. We don't talk about what's enticing you, what's pulling you. We say, don't do that. You know, we've got to talk about the pulls towards using either pornography or being involved in different sexual things and any kind of sexual addictions, any kind of use of sexuality. And then the other thing is that when we're talking about pornography, we tend to just say, don't do that, but then we forget that let's talk about the bigger picture and how it objectifies the body, how it depersonalizes the person, men and women, and how it can lead to compulsions and addictions. But sometimes we use the compulsion and addiction fear, and we don't talk about the other pieces. So let's really learn and figure out how to talk openly about pornography. And then it's vital for people when they're trying to figure out how to live purely, when they're surrounded by, huge billboards as you drive around and flashing things on the internet, and you're trying to just read your emails, right? And how do you put an action plan into place to keep yourself pure so that you can think about sexuality the way God wants you to? Well, number one, yes, there are protections for devices. Those are important sometimes to put on. Also, like I started off with, do you understand the biblical idea of sexuality? We want to know how to help people make good sexual choices, but it's got to start with, do we understand what the Bible teaches about sexuality? And I tell people, if you want to really learn not to give in to lust and pornography, you've got to make those men and women that you're looking at on those screens and in those magazines and in those various places that you're looking into people. These are people. And when you're struggling with lusting after somebody who at your work or on the beach or as you're walking along, make that person into a person that has a job, that probably has family they're trying to take care of. Make them into a person. Have a solid plan. That's just huge on pursuing purity. So you can actually look those up later. We're going to go on here. But this is the biggest thing I get from singles is, why don't the married people talk to us about sex? I had somebody literally say to me, she goes, every time I walk in, the marrieds go, shh. And I just feel like it's all of a sudden like a taboo topic. And can we talk about it? I have questions. These are some of the questions they ask. I'm actually going to just hit the ones under students and singles here. They want to know about oral and anal sex. And you know where they're going to find out about it if you don't talk to them? They're going to look on the internet. They want to know about why it's so hard to maintain their purity, and they want to be able to talk to you. And they think that they're the only ones struggling with it when they don't even realize that the married among them are also struggling with it. They want to talk about questions about masturbation and pornography. They want to know what the line is. They're feeling guilty and they don't know what to do about it. And this is the biggest question that comes up because I do these huge workshops and people send in their questions and they'll say, so I've been staying pure and I'm not looking at pornography and I'm not masturbating, I'm doing all. Will my body still work when I get married? If I've shut it down so much, we need to be able to have those conversations. So actually, the longest chapter in this book is the questions from these workshops that I do. They're literal questions from people and how I've answered them. So we need to be able to talk about sexuality openly as a church. We need to address it openly. We often don't know how to talk to children about sex. We tend to be shaming towards sex, and we tend to be sex negative in our churches, and we tend to avoid all those conversations, and we don't always do a great job of teaching how God intends our sexuality to be. I'm not going to go on for the rest of these slides. We're going to end it here. But I just want to encourage you, use what you're hearing today, because the next section is all on parenting, and I actually already talked about that, by the way. We have a whole My Therapist Says on how to talk to your kids about sex, and so that's all in there. I really want to encourage you, at the end of your slides here, you'll find a bunch of questions. Sit down and use those questions to have a conversation with somebody. And it can really open up the doors to a whole new understanding of how God intends our sexuality, and saying that it's okay that we talk about this. So, there you go.
Thank you, Dr. Conzen. Would you join me in thanking Dr. Jennifer Conzen? Thank you. She already mentioned that we had an entire My Therapist Says on that topic, how to talk to your children. It's available. It's free. Dr. Jennifer Conzen was the person presenting that evening. It was fabulous. I wish we just had more people here to hear it and to participate in it. Let's jump into some of our questions, if we may. You're really talking about this idea of getting to know. So gnosis in the original Greek language means to know. And a lot of times in our lives as Christians, we think about God, we talk about God, we reference God, we refer to God, and we forget that God wants to know us. He wants to know us, and we have a deep desire to know Him and to be known by special people in our lives. Yeah. Okay, so that idea of really becoming known is at the centerpiece of this.
Yeah, and not only like knowing about Him,
yes,
but knowing His character,
yes,
how He feels. I have a whole list that I give out. If you send me an email, I'll send it to you, of how God feels about you. Why do I have this list? Because I have had to figure it out through the years. How does God feel about me? I want to know His character. And I talk about that quite a lot, that our knowing of God isn't just knowing the scriptures and going to church. It is, who is He? How does He feel? Mm-hmm. You know, what's He like? What's His character like? We need to, that gnosis means that deep, intimate knowledge of. We need to have that, and then that can guide how we live our lives.
Yes. And even sometimes early on in our development, we can develop a view of who God is by the personal relationships we have or how we've been treated, and then parlay that into, well, that must be how God's character is, instead of really discovering His character and then freely letting Him participate in our lives.
Yeah, there's often a relearning that has to take place.
Yes.
You know, I was definitely one of those people that my view of God was very affected by my view of my dad, and that I had to kind of relearn that God's not my dad, you know, and that God is God, and who is He? And yes, we are very affected by our views of God by the usually parental and caregivers in our lives, but then other ways as well that influence who we think He's, what we think He's like.
Yeah, I think that's why, as simple as it may sound, it's so important in our own spiritual development that we take time to listen to what the Word of God says. That's His truth that speaks truth about His character, who He is, instead of believing He is a character, that we believe He has character. And we enjoy that, and then meditation or fasting, spending time listening carefully. The disciplines of a spiritual life, because that's where we'll captivate this concept of Him wanting to know us. Kurt Thompson wrote a very now famous book on the anatomy of the soul, and he talks about how we want to move from implicit memory to explicit, and sometimes the implicit is our unconscious memory, and those memories can be fraught with or salted with wounds from the past and beliefs that we have about God, and we need to somehow move the implicit to the explicit, and that's where we're aware of our own feelings and then being aware of perhaps God's feeling for us, that idea of knowing us. So when we think about these concepts, one of the first questions that was raised, I received this as the first question, and it's a pretty broad one, and one that you've dealt with on many occasions, Dr. Conson, and so have I in the therapeutic sessions. But how can the church combat the increasing trend of cohabitation, especially for those within the church? I know it can sound like a generic, not that it does to me, it can sound like, or it may sound like a generic question of cohabitation, but it has infiltrated our society. Some of the language that you mentioned earlier about misled leaders who would indicate you just go right ahead and have sex. And of course, at the very heart of cohabitation is sexuality. How have you responded to that question? How can the church combat, and we probably have within this crowd here tonight, and those listening, probably have a loved one who's caught up in cohabitation, and without going into all of the detail, it leads to disaster. Even the secular research for the last 35 to 38 years will show it leads to absolute disaster for a couple in many different arenas. But what's your thought about that? What are some ways to deal with this very important question?
You know, I think you have to honestly get back to just what we talked about, that whole basic of this is actually what crosses my mind. Matthew 5, Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, and they will be filled.
Yeah.
Like, if you're hungering and thirsting for God, then you just want righteousness. You just want to do what God wants.
Yes.
You know, and so really it does come down to how our relationship with God is going.
Yes.
And do we trust that he knows what's best? Because in all honesty, the things that are out there right now is, how are you going to know if you're compatible if you're not living together?
Right. It's a very
how are
common.
you know if you're sexually compatible if you don't, see? Because let me tell you, if you're not compatible and then you get married, you're going to live with this, difficult situation. And so we better figure it out ahead of time, right?
How do you respond to that, by the way? That's
because
a good
the
question.
reality is sex is so much greater than being sexually compatible. Sex is actually about being giving and loving to one another.
It's a spiritual experience.
Let me tell you.
Yes.
So let me give you an example. I have a couple that I work with. They actually lead a ministry called the Strength and Weakness Ministry. And he is actually a same-sex attracted individual who in his 20s became a Christian. And he has lived without acting out on his same-sex attraction for the last probably coming on 28 years. He's been married for 25. He has 4 children. And they are amazing. His wife and he are amazing. And so people ask him, so you're still not attracted to women? He goes, no, I'm still not. Well, then how does that kind of work between you and Kathy? Like, how do you, end up having a good sexual relationship? And he was like, you know what? People talk a lot about attraction. And let me tell you, attraction's overrated. I was like, and Kathy, if you ask her and you say, what's it like being married to somebody that isn't sexually attracted to you? And she goes, actually, it's kind of freeing. I don't have to worry about my body image because I know I'll never be what he's attracted to. And she goes, you know what it's all about? She goes, we're super giving to one another. She goes, he's super giving to me sexually. And yeah, she's very giving to him. She's hilarious. And so they talk super openly about it's all about being giving.
Yes.
It's not about how we have to try out the goods ahead of time. We have to be attracted to one another. Sexuality is about intimately knowing one another.
Yeah, because that
about intimate connection.
Intimate connection, yes. Because the question you asked is really, we have to be biologically compatible.
Right, we have to be.
Which leaves out the mind,
out
the
the
soul,
majority
and the
of us,
heart.
actually.
Pardon me? I'm sorry.
It leaves out the majority of us.
Yes,
If we're waiting to be biologically compatible, well, good luck as you age and your body changes. And so the reality is, it's about giving and loving. And so 2 people who might not start out compatible, because let me tell you, a lot of people get married and it doesn't work so well right after the honeymoon, and they come in frustrated and seeing me and they're not so compatible. But when they learn to be giving to one another, it's amazing how well things can go.
And it's I don't know the stats on that, but my experience in working with couples too is that's a high proportion of many couples after their wedding and actually their honeymoon. Assuming that they've been pure abstinent before the marriage, that there's challenges, and if there was activity before, it can even be worse because of the expectation of what it was going to be.
It does affect things big time.
Yes, there's this next particular question, and I think that is so important, the idea of giving. You've talked about this.
Right.
In this idea of giving is a couple even being able to talk about the sexuality before the sexual experience, because there's sexuality going on before and even after. That's talking about. Here it looks like a young person in our audience that raised this question, that it said, my girlfriend and I tend to talk about our sexuality frequently. Is this positive or negative? This reads as though it's a very young person in our crowd here.
I love
what
that
a great question, isn't it?
It's such a good
My
question.
girlfriend and I tend to talk about our sexuality frequently. Is this positive or negative?
Yeah. Actually, one of the things I tell people is if you're not talking about it, then how in the world are you going to make good sexual choices? And so I tell dating couples, you should be talking about it ahead of time so that you can decide, hey, you know what? What are your convictions? What are your convictions? How are we going to live these out? What kind of boundaries should we have? There's a gal who, I can't remember her book, but she talks about how her pastor said, you know what? Whatever, there's a rotunda, like a gazebo in the middle of the campus that they were on, and he said, whatever you can't do on the rotunda, that can be your guideline on what you ought to do in your dating relationship. You know, in other words, where people are walking by.
Right.
And she goes, I just kept thinking, the rotunda.
The rotunda.
You know, and that's going to be our guideline, what we do or don't do. And so, you know, if you're not talking about it, then what happens is, when a line is crossed that you might have in your mind, you're not able to come back and say, hey, wait a minute, let's come back to this. Let's renew our conviction about what we want to be doing here. And so, so sometimes the question is, should we be talking openly to the point that we're engaging in sexuality? And I think that's where I tell people, you need to sit down and examine the scriptures together, and so that you can make good biblical decisions on how to live out your sexuality during your dating life.
So even without the talking, say you leave the talking out, then what can happen is it becomes more of a biological drive.
It does,
and
because
then
you're not making good spiritual decisions.
Yes, and then it becomes very selfish.
Yeah.
So my own spiritual drive leads the way here, and then it's confusing if the couple stops or...
And what can happen is one of them might actually have some internal thing saying, you know what, they might have their own guidelines, and they don't verbalize them.
Yes.
And so they go ahead and go along instead of saying, you know what, that's not what I want. So the talking about it allows each to respect the other.
Yes. I sat down with a gynecologist one day, and I just asked him the question. We were at a conference, so we were sitting. I didn't sit down with him, but I asked him, what do you deal with in your practice? And he said, well, this is how it goes. He said, a woman comes in, and I ask her, he's the gynecologist. He said, I asked her, how's your dating life? What's your life like? And he said, this is the majority of my women in my practice. They will say, if I don't have sexual intercourse on the first night, he won't invite me back. Now, to think that's a misnomer or not true, so that's saying that means that young woman or that woman is unable to express her safe boundaries and has to acquiesce. That sounds very chauvinistic or gender-driven. It was a very interesting statement.
And it is interesting that you bring it up, because it can be both ways. Because let me tell you, I have plenty of men who are like, I didn't want to, but then I went ahead and did, and now I regret it. You know, the reality is it really can be both directions, and that's why the talking about it is so vital.
Yes, very good. The next question, this is talking about another young teen. I know there's some leaders here from our youth group here at Skyline. This would be a wonderful presentation to present, because it's free, and you could have Dr. Jennifer Conzen right there with them through videotape. We have a teen in our family who seems to think she has a same-sex attraction. She attends church regularly. How should we guide her? Should we limit contact with friends or change schools? What should we do? Here's the question. We have a teen in our family who seems to think she has a same-sex attraction. How should we guide her?
You know, I think what's really important is how to have a calm conversation, and how to have a loving conversation, and how to draw out what they're thinking and feeling. And then it depends on, it's very different if a teen feels those things and wants to act on them, and feels those things and is choosing not to act on them. So those are going to be two different kinds of conversations.
Yes.
But the short answer that I would really recommend is, this is going to sound contrite, but go and buy Guy and Kathy Hammond's book. It's called Caring Beyond the Margins, and he tells you exactly how to have these conversations in your families. And he does such a good job of number one, have the conversation. Talk openly about it. Share. You can absolutely share your convictions. You can be open and honest and not be condemning of their views, but you can still be open and honest. And then definitely continue to have those open and honest conversations. You know, that it's okay to keep talking about their different views, because right now they're hearing all kinds of different things in their schools and on their campuses, and there's very valid concerns they're having. And so that respectful, open, and honest conversation is huge. And then one of the biggest things is that I talk with parents about, make sure that you're not just defining your child with this part of their life. They are also a good student, and they enjoy horseback riding, and they like to write poetry, and they do paint. Like, there's other aspects of their character. What can happen with parents is they can get so focused on the concern about their sexuality that they forget and to love all the other parts of their child. And so, you know, one of the biggest things for parents is to watch reactivity, because, you know, it brings up a lot of fears and a lot of emotions. And to have somebody to talk to openly about that is huge.
So your own reactivity as the parent.
Yes, your own reactivity is huge. You can still have deep convictions about what the scriptures teach, and you can still speak them super honestly and genuinely and not be condemning or reactive, or, you know, you could still be loving in the midst of it.
If you don't mind, let's act this out.
Yeah.
I'd like for you to be the therapist. I'm going to act as though I'm a female. I'm not. I'm a male. But I've had many patients, young people over the years, and I do know some of the language they use and some of the anxiety they're feeling, and I'm going to act that out, if I may.
Sure.
And you're the therapist, and how you would treat my experience. Okay, so we're play acting. I'm acting as though I'm a female at this point. This can happen to males as well, but I've had many females over the years. So saying that I just grew up, I've been a tomboy my entire life, and now I'm 15, but I have no interest in boys. You know, I have feelings like I would like to be married to a female. I have a lot of feelings, and I've been trying to tell it describe it to my parents. I want to bind my breasts so that I can flatten my chest. I want to have I want to have testosterone. My dad won't let me at this point, so I'd like to have that treatment so I can actually move in a different direction with my body.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Well, you know, tell me early on, you said that I felt like a tomboy, and, you know, and tell me what you mean by that. Like, sometimes what can happen is like, this is what a boy is supposed to do, and this is what a girl's supposed to do. Did it feel like that I'm not doing the typical things that a girl wants to do?
Yeah, I was, because, I had actually, I have an older sister and I have a younger brother, and actually they kept saying, you need to do things like your sister. You need to. And I had no interest. I wanted to play with my brother and his friends. That's what I enjoyed the most. So my body, I really felt more like a tomboy. That's what I mean. I was very active, climbing trees. I didn't really want to play with dolls. I just really enjoyed what boys did.
How old were you when you first
Very young. I felt that really from very early age.
Yeah. And so did it bring up a lot of distress for you, a lot of worry for you?
Oh, yes, it did, because I didn't seem to fit. My folks were always, my parents were always kind of telling me that I should act like this, or I should be like that. And also, my parents had a lot of stress between the two of them as well. But I didn't quite understand all of that. And it made it so I really couldn't talk to anyone. I just knew my feelings, and my feelings.
So you had these feelings of, I'm not like other girls.
Oh,
I'm
yes,
a tomboy,
very much.
And yet you didn't really have a place where you could talk about it. Sure. And then you said that then you started feeling you're attracted to other girls, right? And can you describe that for me, what you mean by that a little bit more?
Well, the attraction is that I wanted to be friends with them, but I enjoyed hanging around the boys. So I still liked girls, but the more I wanted to hang around the boys, the more I seemed to like the girls. Now that I'm 15, going on 16, there's a stronger attraction to girls than I had than when I was a little girl.
And would you say like a sexual attraction or an emotional attraction or both? Or?
It was first emotional. I think just emotional, but I've never had sex with another girl, so I don't know. So it's more of, I think, emotional attraction.
Now, you've grown up in a family, and do you get different messages from your family, or do you get, like, are you attending a church as well?
Yes. My family were very much part of church, and the church really doesn't know my issue.
Okay.
Because I'm able to kind of play the part,
Okay.
and so I've really not come out, so I've
So
not
you
really
haven't
shared
talked
that.
with people
yes.
about the things that you're feeling and wondering and stuff like that.
Yeah, although I've talked to my family because my dad will not let me move toward T until I'm
Oh, right.
testosterone treatment until I'm
Okay.
18.
And so there hasn't been a lot of being able to talk with others about it, about what you're feeling and thinking.
Right.
Okay.
I really talk to my older sister, and she really gets me, even though
Okay.
she doesn't have the same feelings as me. She's
Right.
very, very, if you want to call it, female-y, dress up
Right.
and dressy and all of that. And
Well,
she
and
liked dolls. I never liked dolls growing up.
Right.
Mhm.
Well, I would imagine, has it through the years with your involvement in church and your involvement with your family, has this brought up a lot of turmoil for you?
Yes, a lot of guilt. I mean,
A
I
lot
feel
of
guilty
guilt.
feeling this way, but
Okay.
this really is who I am.
Okay, so it feels like this is who I am, and yet I feel guilty about it.
Yes, there's,
Good here. Do you want to keep going?
that's good. Okay, so thank you. Now, talk a little bit about that, what you were attempting to do, if we can. I think it's very helpful
I
to
think
model.
the main thing is, and it's such a good thing that somebody put that question in there, is Proverbs 20, verse 5. The purposes of a man's heart are deep waters, and a man of understanding draws them out.
Mm.
You know, I think it's important to be kind of matter of fact, to ask questions, to draw things out. Now, obviously, as a therapist, there are some legal limitations in certain states on just all that we can do in therapy. But definitely as ministry individuals, as family individuals, you can delve into some of those questions on. So tell me about some of those turmoils. Is it somewhat connected to things that you're hearing at church or scriptures that you've heard? And then you can get into some of the aspects of, what they're thinking around the Bible and God. And those are just really helpful conversations to have, really important to explore together. Draw it out, like Proverbs 20, verse 5 says.
So part of looking at sexuality is really trying to understand the person, not just understand them, but get to know them, what they're experiencing. God does that with us. You use the woman caught in adultery. He really tried to understand where she was, right, but tried to get to know her. Sometimes we think we're getting to know someone when we're just trying to understand. Let me go a little, does that make sense? Understanding that we go back to that gnosis concept to really get to know that person. There's another question that's asked. We have a few more minutes here, and it seems so hard. This person says, it seems so hard to find a Proverbs 31 woman. How would you, this is a great question, okay, and how would you, Jennifer, Dr. Kanzan, if you were a guy, we're kind of switching our genders here, aren't we, this evening? So if you were a guy, how would you go about finding that type of woman? And what's the best way to restrain from sex before marriage? We have talked about that second question
Right.
some. But the first one, if I may ask you, how would you, if you were a guy, go about finding that type of woman? This is a great question. I know
Yeah,
it can
it is a
sound
great
so
question.
elementary, but it's such a powerful question, really.
I tell people, don't just look for somebody who comes to church. Don't just look for somebody who, carries their Bible around. Find out, how much do they let people in their lives? And how much do they share openly about their lives? So what you're looking for is the heart of somebody that follows Jesus. Somebody that is a disciple of Jesus, who goes after the scriptures and obeying them, and who actually lets people in. I am like, so if you're going to date somebody, are they open with other people about their challenges and about their life? And are they letting other people in? How teachable is this? What I'm really looking for is how humble and teachable is this individual? Not just do they go to church, but do you see them? Well, honestly, all of us that need to start there first ourselves. Do we let ourselves... all those different scriptures about admonish one another, teach one another. Are we in those relationships? And are we attached to somebody who's also in those kind of relationships? How are we letting other people into our lives? Because let me tell you, if they're not letting people in to help them now, they aren't going to let people in to help them when you're married.
That's the
and
teachable.
There's challenges. That's the teachable part.
Yes.
And so it's just far beyond all the other pieces that we tend to look at. But look at the heart before God. And I do think it is important to, I would like to address, read the second part again.
Oh, the second. part
How-
was, excuse me. Oh,
How do we stay?
excuse me. I moved
No,
it here
that's
real
okay.
quickly.
It kind of has to do with how do we, stay pure in that relationship.
Oh,
You know,
and,
the
and
reality
what's the best
is-
way? Yeah, what's the
yeah.
best way, sorry, to restrain from sex before
So
marriage?
the main thing is, what else are you doing in your relationship? If your relationship is focused on, let's give to other people together. Let's go serve and build a house in Tijuana together. Let's go give and make meals and bring them to the poor. Let's teach the Bible together. Like if your life is consumed with serving God together as a partnership, you know what? It really helps with the kind of sexual choices you're going to make. And the other thing is, don't be alone.
Right.
I'm telling you, double date. Okay, I know that sounds really stupid, but it's like this old-fashioned thing. Like you're not going to struggle with sexuality if there's two other people sitting there. So my husband and I, when we were dating, it was literally, he drove me home one time from a Bible Talk Leaders meeting, and he's on one side of the car facing me, and I'm on the other, and we're having this kind of very genuine, real conversation. We have this reality of we're alone in a car, and so we were careful about even you know what, let's not do that again, because we didn't do anything, but there's this pull of when we're alone, you're attracted to each other, and so while you're dating, be smart. So I tell people, be wise about the circumstances you put yourself in.
So you're going back to the idea of giving.
Yeah.
The idea of giving to others.
Yeah.
I've asked
what's best for them.
over the years, the university students, they've said this in one way or another, and
Yeah.
asked this very question. How do I find the right person? Which is a great, great question.
Yeah.
And my one response, and I try to say something more than just this, is become that person.
Yeah.
And so in other words, are you a giving person?
Yeah.
Are you an open
Are you
person?
considering what's best for them? Because,
Yes.
boy, if you keep your mind on what's best for them, and I want to honor them, sex is honoring the
Yes.
other. So I want to honor this person.
Yes.
If I'm really focused on honoring them, I'm going to make some different choices.
Dr. John Gottman said something
Yeah.
very, very profound. He has lots of profound statements. The one that seems to be profound ties very much into what you just said. And that is when the couple is this is of course a healthy married relationship.
Yep.
When it's in a healthy place, the giving goes a step further because he suggests that you look at your partner, your mate, in a much more positive light than you even see yourself. You really see the attributes. So you're actually giving back to that person because they're
You're
they're
considering
phenomenal.
them better than yourself. Philippians
That's
2.
2. Thank you. Yeah, that giving. We have time for one more question. We have 5 minutes left. This one here, it goes a little different direction. And this is, I'm divorced and used my ex-wife for sex release and stress reduction. I'm looking forward to getting remarried. How do I not relapse into old sexual behaviors and thinking and live a redeemed, sexualized experience that shows the love of God for me? Has a lot of features to that question.
I work with pretty complicated situations when people are married, when they're getting divorced, and when they are divorced. And I had one couple that they were in the process of divorce, and then they were separated, and they were pursuing other relationships. But whenever they would get together to talk about the divorce, they would have sex. And they didn't want to tell me. So they're in my office, and they're like, and I said, so when you got together, did you guys have sex? And they're like, they kind of look at each other, and then they look at me, yes. And I said, tell me what you think about that. Well, we don't want to do that, but we keep doing that. And, it's a little complicated, isn't it? Because you've had this relationship, and now you're ending this relationship, and what do you do? And, it was a really good process to just talk really openly and honestly about what was happening between them and why, and what it was that they were lacking and wishing for, and what happened that night that ended up leading there. And I think one of the main things is, again, I can't emphasize this enough, we don't talk about it enough. We don't have close relationships with other people where we're really discussing what the pulls are. So often what happens, and this comes into the second part of the question, is I'm utilizing this relationship that was my ex to relieve stress. This comes up in my office all the time, the use of sexuality to relieve stress. I get asked it regarding masturbation. I get asked it about, a wife that'll say, I feel used because he just has sex with me because he's stressed. Or I get asked it, actually somebody today in my office actually said, it helps me calm down, and so I therefore want to have sex more often with my spouse. And the thing I tell people is, yes, sex is a de-stressor because it actually fills your body with oxytocin and it lowers your stress response. So it enlivens the body in a lot of different ways. However, to pursue sexuality, to de-stress, is where it can become problematic. As in, there's usually some other things you might want to pursue to help you with your stress. And so I talk about this quite a bit in the book about how often when we feel like we have a sexual need, it might not actually be a sexual need. It might be a need for, I need to go paddleboarding. I need to go walk on the beach and enjoy the view. I need to eat a really good meal with a friend and have a good talk. There might be another need, and because we are feeling a sexual sensation, we think it's a sexual need, when it actually might be something completely different. But because we get in a pattern of meeting that sexual arousal with a sexual response, we think that's what we need, and we get caught in that when it may be something completely different. You may need intimate connection. You may need really great verbal talking and heart-level sharing with somebody else. You may need to go, not a run like, I'm going to try to run my sexuality into the ground and pound it away by going running. But you may need to find some way to express your body and go take a dance class. So there may be things your body is needing, and you've been answering it by doing sexual things. And so opening up what else might be happening here is a huge piece.
Yeah, the first time I had that happen was a couple, they just divorced. I was going to meet with them after this, and as they walked off the steps, they decided they were going to meet someplace and have sexual intercourse. Then I saw many couples, not this exact situation, but oftentimes there was a lack of intimacy and choice and giving. And now, when there were boundaries set, either a separation, divorce, that boundary opened up some freedom in the relationship to express this. But that's a whole nother topic. But we're just about out of time, and we could go on and on.
There is more to answer on that one. So
I know
if
there
that person
is.
wants to come and ask me more,
I know.
or send me an email, I'd be happy to answer.
Okay, your email is?
JenniferConzin@yahoo.com. So my name at Yahoo.
Very good. Well, would you join me in thanking Dr. Jennifer Conzin tonight, Redeemed Sexuality. Thank you very much. I just want to mention our next My Therapist Says. I love this topic. It's with Dr. Barbara Burt, who is an expert in this area. How to tame the worrywart in you and your kids. Just think about that for just a moment. How to tame the worrywart in you and your kids. That's where we have a lot of worry or anxiety that may erupt in our relationship. So thank you for coming this evening. We're going to have a word of prayer, and we'll dismiss for the evening. Yes, one more thing?
I am going to zip straight through here to go out to the book table so that if anybody wants one, I'll be there. And then I will just stand there, and if you have questions, I would be happy to answer your questions.
Okay, let's pray, shall we? Father, thank you for this wonderful dialogue, and thank you for being present in it. Because even as there were voices, both Dr. Jennifer Conzin and myself, voicing concepts, ideas, research, biblical truths, and much more, that the presence of the Holy Spirit is what was most important here. And that was hearing from you. You were speaking individually to each person. So if we heard truth, we know that really came from the Lord. If there was something that was non-truthful, it was not from you. And so we want to leave here this evening with your truth that does set us free. And so we thank you for that this evening. We give you praise in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you again for coming to My Therapist Says.